Okay, yeah, so as mentioned, Shayne Jaquith, river scientist, watershed restoration manager with the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy since 2016. And then prior to that, river scientist with the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation's River Management Program, where I did a lot of technical assistance and outreach, education type stuff. So that's essentially my history. At the Nature Conservancy, really delve into this work, not primarily to restore our own properties, but really to develop expertise and that we can share with others, right? That's really our goal here. So it's really great, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do just that with you all. So thank you very much for the invite. I'm going to start with a little bit of a discussion, a little bit of an explanation of the history of river management. And I suspect you all, most of you all are aware of this, but I thought it would just be good to establish some context. So right there has been a long history of management in Vermont, in New York, in North America, around the world, right? We have dynamited, we have dredged, armored, snagged, otherwise straightened our river channels. We've certainly altered the land cover and land use in ways that have significant implications for our river systems. And there has been consequences as a result of that with respect to the morphology of our condition of our river systems. I don't know, maybe a lot of you are familiar with this. This is the Shum channel evolution model, and it was developed. There are different versions of it. This one was 1984, but it just shows basically, what happens when we alter the riverscape morphology. And in this example, the scenario is that a house gets built on a floodplain of a river that's in relatively good condition. It's a relatively small channel. It is well connected to the floodplain, meaning that any event larger than a 2-year flow event overtops the banks and spills out onto that floodplain, right? Dissipating massive amounts of energy across that broad landscape. The house goes in, of course, those floods happen. The people get tired of being flooded out, so they build berms, and we enter into the stage 2. And those berms disconnect the river from the floodplain. The water of the higher flows can't escape onto the floodplain. The energy is not dissipated on the floodplain, but rather in the channel. So you get this channel incision process. That process keeps going until the banks get so high that they start to fall in, and you enter stage 3, the widening phase. Channel widens for quite some time until it's so wide that the power of the flow in the channel starts to decrease. The amount of sediment coming in starts to outweigh the power of the amount of power that's left, and you enter into the stabilizing stage 4. And ultimately, the new floodplain gets rebuilt in this stable stage 5, and that's what we see, right? We see that all over the landscape, and I'm sure you all do too. So, the Vermont DEC assessed about 5,000 river miles on the ground assessment, and found that 75% of those assessed miles are disconnected from their floodplain. They're in these stages 2 through 4. So they don't have a way to dissipate energy associated with really high flow events, right? And we just see this incredible instability and incredible damage to our rivers and surrounding landscapes and infrastructure during flow events. So instead of these nice small channels that can flood when you get a flow event of the 2 or 5-year magnitude, we have these incredibly large channels, right? And instead of that flow escaping onto the floodplain, it's trapped into the channel. And again, the consequences for surrounding investments we are all too familiar with. So that's kind of the river management history and the consequences, and I think we're all probably familiar with that. So thanks for bearing with me on going through what you probably already are familiar with. So I just want to now get into a quick evolution of the science of fluvial geomorphology, because I think this has real underpinnings for this low-tech process-based restoration approach. So our rivers are in rough shape. We know that. We need to restore our rivers, but the damage was done so long ago that we're not really sure what the shape and form of those rivers, what does a restored river look like? So we look to the science, we look to the textbooks, and we find the classic meandering single thread channel as the envisioned pre-disturbance condition, right? And we read that the flow, the hydrology, and the geology are the dominant drivers of river form, river condition, river processes. But in 2000, shortly after 2000, a lot of post-2000 research has been done that really challenges that idea of the single thread channel as the dominant channel in the broad alluvial valley setting. There's a series of papers listed here from different regions of the world that have been done, that have papers that have come out that have really shown that the dominant morphology is more of an anastomosing or multi-thread channel, heavily influenced by beaver and other biological elements and activities, often surrounded by broad wetlands, right? So the idea of the single thread channel as the dominant channel is really being challenged. This is from one paper, the paper from the Eastern U.S. This is by Merritts, Walter Merritts, and Watts. And basically they dredged down, or they excavated down through these, or they did borings through these alluvial settings, and they found that down below all this alluvium was all this sort of really, it was beaver remnants, beaver pond and complex remnants, mud and sticks and other things. And then in that sediment themselves, they found tree stumps. And, by doing some dating, they realized that these sediments that our rivers flow through are mostly sediments backed up behind old mill dams. And these rivers have incised those sediments, right? And that if we make our way through all that material, what we find are really complex multi-thread channels. And, lo and behold, we might go and try to create a single thread channel like the Department of Environmental Conservation did, our rivers program did back in the mid-2000s here in Montgomery, Vermont. But if you leave it all alone, you start to see that it really wants to transition back to that multi-thread condition. So, this idea that hydrology and geology are the main drivers of river morphology and process all starts to be questioned, right? We start to see the influence of beaver. We see the influence of wood and, both living and dead biological materials. And we think about and come to realize that the influence of biology really is to cause our channels to fill in or grade, right? And that's really the reverse of what, the current condition is with all of our rivers, in more of an, the incising condition. So we start to think about that and what what the biology can do for us, perhaps. So I show the Shum evolution model, it's based on observations of rivers that had, the way this came to be is that scientists were observing rivers that had long been disturbed, right? And they really didn't think about that. And that's how we came to have this misunderstanding of the single channel as the dominant channel morphology type in the U.S. But now we understand the biology plays a huge role. And, instead of, sorry, I'm going to back up there. Instead of this sort of one-way evolution process, really linear and only one directional with an endpoint at stage 5, we start to understand that with biology, we can actually go to stage 5, which in this image really is probably represented by subfigure D, we can really go back, and these channels can come back and be reconnected, reconnected essentially to their original floodplains and reestablish that multi-thread, really low energy morphology. And in fact, a couple of researchers, Kluwer and Thorne, in 2014, came up with did a pretty extensive paper and developed a much more complex cyclical channel evolution model that does, at the top, you'll see starts with that multi-thread channel. They call it the stage 0 channel. And that's really the pre-disturbance condition. It's much more complex. It involves biology and it's cyclical. So you can, it does show that you can get back almost, or, near that original pre-disturbance condition. And one of the really interesting things that they did in this paper is they looked at the habitat and ecosystem benefits associated with the different stages of channel evolution. And they came up with this table that ecosystem benefits table. And what you see across the top, the different stages of channel evolution. So stage 0 and stage 8, stage 0 being the pre-disturbance condition, and then stage 8 being about as close to the recovered condition as you can get. Those are both in the table outlined by the green boxes. And then in the red box, you see all of the single thread stages of the channel evolution process. And they rank, the value, whether it's habitat, water quality, biota, or resilience. They rank the value of the services provided by those different channel morphologies. And you can see on the bottom where that red arrow is that the stage 0 ratio, or the score, is 97%, and the stage 8 score is 88%, and everything else in between is quite a bit lower. So there's really they just did a really good job demonstrating the ecological value associated with these different channel types, and how valuable the multi-thread channels are from a biological ecological perspective. So this evolution of the scientific understanding has begun to lead to a change in the restoration practice itself. With new understanding, or actually, let me say, with our old understanding, we often looked to reconstruct single thread channels, and that image on the bottom is one that I reconstructed. So I've been part of it myself, with heavy machinery, using a lot of engineering, right? With the idea, we were all really sold on this idea that if you built the morphology correctly, you could balance the force of the hydrology with the resistance of the geology and create a quasi-stable channel with good ecological, characteristics, values, and everybody would be happy. So that was what we all endeavored in. But of course, this process is very expensive. With our new, understanding, again, there's been this slow transition. Well, not slow, I guess, and it's still happening. And it's probably it will continue to happen. But there's this transition of the idea of what it means to restore a river. And again, the few facts that underlie or propel us in this new direction. One, the scope of degradation of riverscapes is massive. I don't know if anybody has read the book Eager, but in that book, The Secret Lives of Beavers, there was a quote that the cost to restore all of the degraded miles of river in the U.S. would be the EPA's total budget for a total of 6 or 7 years. So it's just massive. Another fact, structural starvation, or the removal of wood, is a direct cause of a majority of the degradation that we see. And then the third is that engineering-based restoration tends to emphasize channel form and stability, as I mentioned, rather than promoting processes that create and maintain healthy riverscapes. And that leads to an increase in cost and limited ability to restore more miles of riverscape. So those are some of the facts that people have been thinking about recently, particularly a bunch of folks out west that have come together based out of Utah State to form this low-tech process-based restoration consortium. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this resource, but if you aren't, it's fantastic. Lots of documentation, lots of recorded webinars that you can view to educate yourselves on low-tech process-based restoration. While these folks are, really leading the way in promoting riverscape low-tech process-based restoration, I think they would agree that they're not the only ones, and their ideas are not the only ideas, and we shouldn't, adhere religiously to any one group of folks and their ideas. I think there's lots of different ways this work can be done, but they are leading and helping to promote it and share resources about it. So it's an easy resource to draw from. And so low-tech process-based restoration, what is it? They define it as a practice of using simple, low unit cost structural additions, i.e. wood accumulations and beaver dam mimics, adding those to riverscapes to mimic functions and initiate specific processes. Hallmarks of this approach include an explicit focus on the processes that a low-tech restoration intervention is meant to promote, a conscious effort to use low-cost, effective low-tech treatments, i.e. hand-built natural materials, non-engineered short-term design lifespans, because of the need to efficiently scale up application. And then 3, and this is a great one for anybody that's ever engaged in engineering of river restoration designs, letting the system do the work and really deferring critical decision-making to the riverscapes and letting nature's ecosystem engineers really decide questions like, what should the bankful width of the channel be? What should the bankful depth be? What should the sinuosity of the channel be? Things like that. So those are just some basic hallmarks of low-tech process-based restoration. This slide just shows a table from the LTPBR, Low-Tech Process-Based Restoration Manual, from the Utah State folks. And I put it in here because I just wanted to show that, they're not claiming to have created something new. They're not claiming to have created something that only they understand. And the things that they talk about, what we're focusing on here aren't the only forms of low-tech process-based restoration. Things like rotational grazing, right? Changes in irrigation practices. Those are all changes in management that affect the ability of natural processes to take over the restoration process. So I just wanted to share that. Sometimes I think we get really rigid. We give activities labels and titles, and we adhere to those practices in a very rigid manner, and we forget that there are always other ways. And I've seen that happen over the years enough times to want to just caution people against that, I guess. So just a couple more slides here. I just want to share a couple of the riverscape, or a couple of the principles around both riverscapes, and as well as low-tech process-based restoration itself. I think there's a total of 10 principles here, and I think they just provide a nice sort of outline of what LTPBR is all about. And then, of course, Jud and Patrick will follow up and provide more detail and more specifics. So they start the low-tech process-based restoration manual with these principles. And the first are 4 principles about riverscapes. And so really just thinking about rivers and what they need, and first, streams need space, right? And structure forces complexity and builds resilience. And by structure, again, we're talking about wood structures. 3, the importance of structure varies, right? We don't need structure everywhere. It's not appropriate in the same volumes everywhere, depending on the valley morphology, the geology and other characteristics. That the importance of structure varies. We don't want to get carried away everywhere. And then finally, inefficient conveyance of water is healthy, right? A lot of this is about retaining water on the landscape. So there are 4 principles about riverscapes. And then principles about the restoration practice itself. One, it's okay to be messy. That's not that is different, I think, from the more traditional restoration practices that I've been involved with. Two, there's strength in numbers. So they're talking about build more structures. Don't get hung up on building just a few structures and taking, all of your resources, time and money to build those structures. Rather build structures. Don't expect them, a lot of structures. Don't expect them to have lots of a long lifespan. Rivers are dynamic. Wood moves. That in itself is an important process that we are striving for. Three, use natural building materials. I think that's self-explanatory. And then 8, let the system do the work. And I think, a good example of this is, in the form-based or the Roskin, the natural channel design approach, it really all is about identifying what the height of the bank should be to hold the 2-year flow, but then let that 2-year flow flood out, 2-year or higher flow flood out. And a lot of engineering and modeling goes into that. And, this process, or this restoration approach is more about just providing the components of the system and letting natural process work with those components and reshaping the river and finding that appropriate, that equilibrium, if we want to use that word, equilibrium morphology. So let the system do the work, defer decision-making to the system. That's actually what I was just talking about. Let the system do the work is more about just let the flow shape the channel. We don't always need excavators and dozers to move the earth, right? We can let the river do that. And then self-sustaining systems are the solution. That really is the end game. And often, and that most often always means we need the riparian community back. We need the riparian vegetation. And I would say in many cases, it means that we need beavers to re-inhabit these sites because they really are the engineers that maintain these sites, maintain the complexity, maintain the structure. So that's an important aspect or principle. And then with that, I just want to conclude by saying that while there's a lot of reason to move away from engineered restoration and earth moving more towards a process-based approach, I think it's important to remember, again, not to get hung up and get really rigid about anything. And remember, there's always going to be a place for, heavy equipment, engineering, based restoration. And a lot of these projects, and I think we'll see this in Patrick's projects, a lot of these projects will end up being hybrids. We'll use a lot of low-tech approaches, strategies, but we may also need to incorporate some engineering and some earth moving. And this image right here is a little fluvial wetland that embodies that. Is a good example of that. We created this by doing a little bit of earth moving, but then we installed a bunch of, these are just fascines, right? And fascines and wattles, those are examples of process-based restoration techniques. So with that, I will turn it over to Jud to share more on the strategic wood addition approach, which again is really working in the forested setting. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay.
All right, now I'm gonna share my screen. And hopefully you are seeing my PowerPoint presentation now. Okay, good. Yeah, so following Shayne, I thought, I could talk about a lot of stuff. I'm gonna talk about what I hope will be the most helpful to you and really focus on evaluating whether a process-based restoration technique or method might be appropriate for your whatever situation it is that you're thinking about. Here we go. So as far as the techniques go with low-tech process-based restoration, I think of them as three flavors. The one that I'm most familiar with is strategic wood addition. That's the one that I think that makes a lot of sense here in a lot of places because we have forests to work with. And so we are adding wood by cutting streamside trees into the stream. And they are secured because they're secured by the vegetation and roughness on the in the forest and on the edge of the channel. A technique that they use more out west and has been used in the east as well is post-assisted log structures, which are similar to strategic wood addition because they're adding large woody material, but instead of relying on the forest, the streamside forest to anchor that wood, they're using posts driven into the stream bed to anchor that wood. So similar idea, just different ways to anchor it. And then the third category is beaver dam analogs, which again are using posts, but here they're using usually smaller pieces of wood and maybe some sod to build something like a beaver dam. And I just want to briefly talk about strategic wood addition, because that's the one I have the most experience with, to give you a sense for what that is. And I think of it in two categories. One is on smaller streams we call chop and drop, because on a small stream with trees that are large relative to the channel, you can drop those trees in and they're not going to move very far, assuming you have trees on the stream bank. Big tree, small stream, they can't really move very far. So you can drop them. You don't need to worry about moving them much. Still a lot of planning and thought that goes into how you're going to do it, but you don't need to worry about it so much once they're down. On the larger streams, we do what we call chop and grip. And that's because we drop the trees and then we reposition them once they're down to secure them. So that takes longer, it takes a bigger crew, takes longer. Just want to show you some pictures to give you a sense for what we're talking about. This would be chop and drop. Those trees aren't very big, but that channel's not very big. So we don't need very big trees. Those trees are plenty big for that channel, and even during high flows, that wood really can't go very far because the stream is flowing through a forest. Here's a little bit bigger stream, a little bit heavier loading. Again, we're just dropping the trees and not repositioning them. But yeah, a lot of thought goes into which trees we're going to use and how we're going to put them in so they will be secure and functional. On these small streams, we also do a lot of hand placement where we'll cut a log to length and maybe wedge it in place on some boulders or pin it in between some trees on the bank. Maybe we drop another tree on top to weight it down. But on a small stream, you can do that with two strong people can cut a log and lay it in there and then secure it. I could talk a lot about chop and grip techniques. All I'm going to do is put up this slide and show the grip hoist. It's a big come along, and we use that to drag our trees once they're down, and we can wedge them in between standing trees or spear them into the bank. So taking extra steps to get that wood secure once it's down so that it's less likely to move when the flows come up. And I could talk a lot about this as well, but just to show, I need to thank my partners for all the work we've been doing, but we've been doing this for 12 years now in northeastern Vermont. We've treated 62 stream miles, and we've seen a clear response in brook trout and other stream functions. So it's been proven successful for us. You can learn a lot more about the method and a lot more about what I'm going to talk about next in the Vermont Strategic Wood Addition Handbook. If you just do a Google search for that, you should find that. Or feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions as well. But what I want to spend the most time talking about is giving you some questions to think about if you are considering one of these types of projects. And so I'm putting strategic wood addition and post-assisted log structures together because they're both involving large woody material. They're just anchored a little bit differently. And there's three kind of big questions and then some sub questions under those to get you thinking. The first big question is, will adding large wood improve aquatic habitat? Will large wood benefit fish populations? This one might be optional for you depending on what your goals are. You don't have to do this with the goal of benefiting fish, because there's other benefits to adding wood as well. But if if fish is part of your goal, then that's an important question. And then, can large wood be added safely and effectively? And so now I'm just going to go through some sub questions that relate to these. And the first one, looking at, will it improve aquatic habitat? The first question is, does the channel need more wood? Usually we're not looking at channels that have enough wood in them because of all the things that Shayne talked about. But there are upper limits to the amount of wood that we would expect in a stream. And there's some numbers right there that you could consider. If you have that much wood in your stream, you probably don't need to add more. Is the slope and width appropriate for large wood addition? What this is getting at really is stream power. Some streams are just too powerful. They're transport channels, so they're moving things through, including wood. And so you put wood in there, it might break up your wood, it might move it. And usually those channels don't need wood so much because they've got boulders and bedrock and things like that that are creating the habitat. So you don't need the wood. This figure is in the handbook. I borrowed it from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, but it shows the kind of the sweet spot for the slope and bankful width of the stream where doing some habitat restoration might work. Just a quick and easy way for myself when I'm looking at a stream to think about this is, if I see rocks the size of basketballs or larger that are evidence that they're moving regularly, so that's boulder size, roughly the size of a basketball or larger. If I see those rocks moving, that's an indication to me that stream is probably too powerful for us to use these methods, especially if it's a wider stream. And usually that probably means that stream mostly has boulders in it, and you might not need wood anyway because the boulders are providing the roughness. If you're thinking about post-assisted log structures, you probably want even smaller substrate, so even lower power stream, because you have to drive posts into the stream bed. So gravel, so anything smaller than a tennis ball would probably be helpful for that kind of thing. Does the habitat need improvement? So in this stream here, this stream actually has the right slope and bankful width for adding wood to it. But this would be a low priority for adding wood, and that's because just the geology of the area where this stream flows, there's a lot of boulders. And you can see the boulders in that channel and note all the moss on them. That's an indication that those boulders aren't moving. So when you see rocks with moss on them, that means they're probably not moving. So this is not an especially powerful stream, but it's got a lot of boulders in it. The boulders are providing plenty of roughness in this channel. They're providing good, cover for fish. They're capturing organic material and fine sediment, that kind of thing. So this would be a really low priority for adding wood. Can the target wood loading be achieved without significant negative effects on riparian zone function? So what this is getting at is, if you're going to do strategic wood addition, do you have enough trees on the bank that you can cut some of them and not mess up your shading or other functions of the forest? And maybe if you don't, but you want to do something, maybe this is a place for post-assisted log structures, so you can bring that wood in from outside and you don't have to cut trees from the stream bank. And then this is an important question: is there a long-term plan for restoration of natural wood recruitment processes? So you've heard us say the word process a lot, because we don't want to have to be going in here and adding wood every so often. We want the process to be restored and for this to be happening on its own. And so it makes sense to do this work on places where there's a potential for the process to be restored in the long term. so you don't have to keep going in and doing this work, maintaining it forever. All right, and then on to the next, that number 2 question, will large wood benefit fish? Again, this could be optional, but if you are focused on benefiting trout and salmon, one of the first things you need to look at is the water temperature. If you have a warm stream, adding wood to it is not going to bring trout or salmon into it. Adding wood may benefit stream temperature, but I wouldn't count on it. So if your target is trout or salmon, make sure you have the right water temperature where you're going to do this. And then, is there evidence that large wood is a limiting factor for the target species? So water temperature is an obvious limiting factor, but it's possible there could be something else like water quality or lack of access to spawning habitat or whatever. So that in those cases, adding wood might not really benefit your fish. But again, if it doesn't benefit fish and it doesn't do harm to fish, you get other benefits from adding wood. So that might just be fine. And then that third big question was, can the wood be added safely and effectively? And the first question there is, will the large wood be stable in the stream? And as I said before, if it's on a small stream, the trees are big relative to the channel, we can be confident that wood's not going to move, or not, at least not move very far. But when you get on these little bit bigger streams, as you see in the picture in the center, we need to take some added steps to make that wood secure. And then if the wood does move, where is it going to end up? Again, on small streams, as long as you're, at least 500 feet upstream of a culvert or bridge, you're probably going to be fine because the wood is really not likely to move that far. But on bigger streams, you don't want a bridge or culvert or somebody's yard to be the first place that wood ends up if it does move. So you want to know where it's going to go. And in the picture, there are some examples of where you might expect the wood to accumulate. And then, is there an acceptable plan for long-term monitoring? The Department of Fish and Wildlife has spent a lot of time, a lot of energy monitoring these projects in northeastern Vermont. We've looked at responsive fish, the function of the structures, how long they're lasting. I'm not saying that everybody has to do that, but there should be at least some long-term monitoring, even if you're just looking at some of your structures every couple of years, because that's really how you learn. That's how you learn what works, what doesn't work. Every stream's a little bit different. Everybody that's doing this work does it a little bit differently. So you really need to go out and learn from your successes and failures. Okay, now moving on to considerations for beaver dam analogs. I put these kind of on their own because they are different. They're usually have different goals, and they're using different material than strategic wood addition and post-assisted log structures. But I have 2 kind of overarching questions here. Are the goals, objectives, and collateral outcomes acceptable? And then, are the goals and objectives achievable? All right, so, are the outcomes acceptable? Usually with a beaver dam analog, you're trying to impound water and sediment. And is that going to be okay? There have been studies on at least trout movement through beaver dams, and brook trout in particular seem to be pretty well at getting over and through beaver dams. But if you're looking to do one of these projects in a place where there are fish, especially trout, I can guarantee you someone is going to ask that question. And so you need to be prepared to answer it. Also, water temperature. Some studies have shown that beaver dams can increase water temperature. Some have shown that they decrease water temperature downstream. And so this is another issue, especially if there's trout in the stream. What do you think is going to happen with water temperature, and is that going to be okay? And then there's this, I thought maybe Shayne would use this fancy word, but he didn't. So anastomosis is the idea of, these different kind of these channels that kind of branch and rejoin and they shift around. And is that going to be okay? So I don't know anything about this. I just kind of pulled this off the internet, but there's a single thread channel there. Looks like beavers colonized it. and resulted in these beaver impoundments. And you can see all those other little channels that kind of formed. And I think that looks great, but if somebody has a house right there, or there's a bridge or a road, maybe that isn't going to be okay. And then is beaver colonization going to be okay? These beaver dam analogs can attract beavers, and probably, hopefully they do, because beavers can maintain them and do a lot of good. But beavers can also be a problem for our culverts, or they could be cutting trees down on somebody's property. And so maybe having beavers there is not something that people want to have. And then the next big question, are the outcomes achievable? So I guess a good rule of thumb for where a beaver dam analog might work would be where you might expect a beaver to build a dam if it had the wood to do it. And so if you look around and you've seen where beavers are building dams, it's usually on relatively small, low gradient streams. So, you know, in the past, they probably did it on bigger and steeper stuff. But what we see today is on usually small, low gradient streams. So that's what you're looking for a place to do this. And then again, what are the long-term plans? These are going to require monitoring and probably maintenance. Beavers are naturally maintaining their dams all the time because they need it. And so these things, if a beaver doesn't take up residence there, you might need to be the one that goes out and maintains these. And again, we want to see the natural process restored. So, and that's the long-term goal. And that takes me to this slide just as a reminder. You know, we talk about restoration, and it's exciting to do, and it has benefits for the stream where you're working. But really, the big benefit I see of doing restoration work is really to change the culture about how streams function and wood in streams. Because one thing we've learned in Vermont, you've probably seen it in New York as well, as a result of the floods over the last couple decades, is that people generally do not know how streams function, and they really don't know the value of wood in streams. And so one of the reasons we're doing this kind of work is to say, look, these experts think that wood in streams is so important that we're putting it in ourselves. And so we want to encourage people to protect the forest on the stream banks, because those are the trees that are going to fall in naturally. And when the wood is in the stream, leave it there. Because a lot of people's tendency is to want to get wood out. We want to have people leave it in as much as is safely possible. And yeah, that's it at that. And I'll turn it over to Patrick to talk about working in more of the agricultural setting.
Thank you, Jud. Everybody hear me good? Good. All
Yep.
right.
Hear you.
Pull up my slides here. So that was an excellent segue to talking about working with wood on smaller, shallower gradient streams. This is one of my favorite images. I don't know how to make this go away. Maybe it'll go in its own. So this is one of my favorite images in the world of process-based restoration. It really shows you this transition from kind of these, you know, anthropomorphically altered stream systems on the left, where you have something that's channelized and incised and really doesn't have any access to its floodplain. It doesn't have a stick of wood living on the banks of the brook, and it's a conveyor of sediment and water, and it's very efficient at that. It will transport whatever it has the power to move, including houses and bridges and all the biologic integrity in a system. And so this is usually the result of some sort of, you know, human-induced modification, whether it's, you know, clear cutting in the headwaters, which results in faster runoff rates and larger flood volumes, or channelization, you know, ditching, dredging, berming, you know, clearing, you know, the streamside forests, And so it's reacting. It's going through that cycle that Shayne showed us earlier, where the stream is essentially on this trajectory, and it's going to kind of unwind itself until it finds a new equilibrium. And so we're trying to kind of accelerate that by returning structure to the system in the form of wood and bringing these processes back that allow a stream to, heal itself or reach that dynamic equilibrium a bit faster. I like to use the phrase, wood is the bones of a river, because otherwise it is just this fluidized bed. And if you don't have large pieces that bind everything together and hold it all, it's really just like an amoeba. It'll keep squiggling around and moving. And so the roots of trees on the bank are included in that bone structure. Log jams are included in that bone structure. And so when Jud adds a bunch of trees to a river, it's adding structure. And that kind of dichotomy that he showed us, where it's streams of certain size with trees of certain size, they're suitable for project. Well, we're a little bit different size stream. We're typically talking about a smaller stream. It might have a much broader valley, but it might be disconnected from that valley, that floodplain. And oftentimes it's the most heavily altered system. It's an agricultural field, or downstream of development, or it's pasture or something. And so by bringing this wood in, you can see through those different panels, the stream has a little bit of a wiggle at first, because you're adding beaver dam analogs that are impounding water, and then eventually those things will be breached or flanked one side or the other. It'll add a little bit of curvature to the stream as it cuts at one bank and deposits silt sand on the other bank. Eventually, the goal is that beaver colonization occurs passively on its own. Until Vermont allows us to relocate beavers, we have to wait for them to show up on their own. And then ultimately you end up with this anastomosed system at the end, where there is no discernible channel. There's many channels. There's backwaters, there's eddies, there's puddles, there's swamps, and it's incredibly difficult to walk through as a human, but it's incredibly high quality habitat for virtually everything else. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to add structure so that the stream doesn't continue to unravel itself, but we're also trying to upgrade the channel itself, retain materials, retain sediment, retain organic, debris, retain, or just allow vegetation to grow, woody vegetation to grow, and eventually we'll have this resilient, shallower system that has a broader footprint than this narrow, confined slot canyon or flume. And so I've been involved in, beaver mimicry work, we used to call it, since about 2014. This, I got started in this work out west. I want this to go away. How do I move this? There, okay. So this is a really early project in western Montana. You can see on the lower left, that's what the system we were dealing with. This thing was like 2 feet wide. You could trip over it and not get wet. And the first year we started adding these beaver dams, all of a sudden we've got an 8-foot wide channel. The next year we keep building off these beaver dams. Now we got a 12 to 15-foot wide channel. You can't trip over the stream without getting wet anymore. And you'll notice that not only is the water moving slower, it's dropping out sediment. You can see these little bars of silt and sand and gravel forming. You see a much higher water table near the stream, where it's a lot soggier all the time. This used to run dry in August every year, and now it's a perennial stream again. Granted, this site was so heavily degraded from mining and logging and smelting activities that there's a lot other problems going on. But we initially used these structures, this approach, because we're trying to retain sediment, which was laden with copper, which was killing the fish. So we were trying to lock that sediment in place. Copper behaves chemically very similar to phosphorus, and that's what we are adopting these practices for in Vermont, trying to retain that sediment and the phosphorus that's bound to that sediment. So you can see, they're pretty effective at impounding water in a system that's low gradient, that isn't too powerful, that it doesn't have so much power that it's going to blow the structure out immediately. And you can see that we're not just adding one, we're peppering these things in pretty tightly, because they are not the most resilient structure. Having redundancy is the key piece to making a successful project. So these are two other examples from out west. You can see this is just a dished agricultural stream on the left. You know, within a week of putting some of these structures in, you get a lot more impounded water. You get a lot slower flows. You're storing water. Remember, this is wet. This is dry country, so they want every drop of water they can get. So most of this work, the second goal beyond fish, was water storage, natural water storage. How do we keep these springs and these streams running longer into the summer? That one on the panel on the right, that's the same stream a little further up. You can see again, you can trip over that stream. And nowadays, it's pretty hard to get across based on the height of your boot. Other settings we really love working on are alluvial fans. So alluvial fan is when a steep gradient system, think of a forested ravine, comes out of the hills, opens up into a broad, shallow plain, fans out, spreads out. These are possibly one of the most challenging places in Vermont to work as a river scientist, because everybody loves to put houses right there, and then they just get blown apart. And it's really hard to engineer a bridge to pass over an alluvial fan that might be 500 feet across, but the channel is only 10 feet across. But that channel moves every decade. It might jump 200 feet in one storm and blow out your bridge and your road. And so alluvial fans are really challenging settings to work, but they're also really easy to increase floodplain activity and connection because they have these broad, expansive floodplains. And so sometimes all it takes is one piece of wood to take a 2-foot channel and spread it out across 60 feet to get that nice floodplain dispersion that you see in some of these photos. And again, these are small systems, but when you think about how many miles of stream there are in the world, most of those miles are small streams. And when you look at the research, when you're talking about nutrient cycling, when you're talking about water quality, when you're talking about temperature regulation, you have more impact, pound of effort, dollar you spent working on a small stream. It's more cost effective and more biologically beneficial to work on numerous small streams than focusing on one large main channel. So that's where we're trying to take these projects. Where we can't put strategic wood additions because there's infrastructure that would be at risk from large debris flow or large wood racking up, we try to use these small passive projects, which are relatively expensive and scalable. So moving to Vermont, we just executed a relatively big project for our organization. We're in the Northeast Kingdom, I live 6 miles from the border. This project's 4, and this is central Vermont, so we're about 30 minutes east of Jay Peak. The project is on Valley Brook. This is now a Fish and Wildlife owned property, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, that is, and it's what we call a stream bank management area. So it used to be a dairy farm, and it was a pretty beaten up dairy farm. It had been farmed for about a century on and off, and you can see on the left, there's no riparian vegetation. There's a lot of hummocking, which sometimes is a good thing. It means there's lots of wetland plant development. And here, it's because the cows were beating it to death, more or less. You see a lot of bank erosion. There's a lot of runoff of phosphorus, sediment and manure. It wasn't a great place for water quality or fish. Coincidentally, it was an amazing confluence here. There are 5 brooks that fall into this one property. So there's an immense amount of water on this property. So the farmer sold the property to the state. The state purchased it through this farm retirement program, and then used other monies to essentially decommission the barnyard and take down the barn. So you can see, a couple other shots. We've got a lot of bank erosion, no riparian vegetation, no woody riparian vegetation, not much structure complexity in this stream, and a load of culverts that were both undersized and just in poor condition. So this culvert is 4 feet wide on a 22-foot wide channel. And so you can imagine that once it gets plugged up, or even before it gets plugged up, it just can't convey the amount of water that comes down this system. And so it would blow out, it would flank around, it would cause a big old mess, and it was also a barrier to fish. So we had a lot of goals here. We're trying to restore a trout fishery, we're trying to restore a potential Atlantic salmon fishery. We're really trying to trap sediment and reduce phosphorus loading to the lake because we're dictated by a total maximum daily load. And we have to essentially tie water quality benefits to all of our projects. And there's just a lot of habitat opportunities here. It's 170 acres of forest and meadows. and there's a buttload of fish in this river. So we started, once we knew the barn was coming down, we really thought we had some room to play and figure out a design plan. So we started by doing some pretty intensive surveying of the channel and of the topography and the valley around it, and identifying these areas where there's no floodplain connection. So you can see these this big polygon, this medium size, and the smaller polygon in pink. Those are all areas where our hydraulic models indicated that there was no floodplain connection, even at a 200-year. So we model it to 550 CFS, which on this stream equates to about a 200-year storm. Don't quote me on 200 years because everything's changing hydrologically. So we have no idea what that will equate to in the 2030s. But it's a 550 CFS storm on a pretty small stream. There's a lot of water. But you can see there's no connection by the barn, just below the barn, and where the main crossing is for the farm road. Coincidentally, you can also see there's quite a large kind of abutment of earth right here that's protruding into the floodplain. There's also, can't really tell right now, but the contours on this section show the same thing. And the road over here is essentially blocking flow across the floodplain. So these are 3 areas that we want to focus on for floodplain restoration work. But you see all these little arrows, these are all tributaries coming into the brook. So there's a lot of sources of water coming in. Some of them are just road ditches that are kind of ephemeral streams, and some of them are full-blown perennial tributaries. So we came up with this really complicated plan. We had to get 6 permits. It was quite an ordeal, but it's a project that we pretty much threw everything we had at it. I mean, this is exactly what Shayne meant when he said a hybrid between low-tech passive and active restoration. A lot of this work was done by hand. A lot of this work was done by equipment because a lot of the damage had been done by equipment, and you can't really reverse something that would take, an army of laborers that put up the Tower of Giza to do by hand. So we got to do things effectively and at scale, and I think we did a pretty good job doing that on this project. So first the barn came down. We did our best to salvage everything we could. So all the tin came off the side of the barn. I took some home. A bunch of people took some home. Every one of the roof trusses went to a new home. The contractor took half of them. The farmer up the road took the other half. We took out 22 truckloads of 12 truckloads of tires and 20 truckloads of trash, which is mostly just baling plastic and bale wrap. But you can see, we decommissioned the manure pit, taking down the barn, and then you can see these 2 red polygons are highlighting the telephone poles. This is more or less the same shot. This is the barnyard just a month later. We took everything out, buried the concrete and untreated wood, recycled everything we could, disposed of the rest, and then we regraded the slope. We didn't want any of this barnyard just washing away into the brook, which is right below it. And you might ask, well, where'd you get all this beautiful, nice soil that grows such lush green grass? Well, we took it from the floodplain where it had been put how many decades before. They had graded out this barnyard, pushed all the dirt up against the brook, made everything flat. And when we're going through the analysis, we found out that the team that was hiring out the barn decommission, they were going to have to truck in like 2,000 yards of dirt to cover this whole barnyard area. I was like, we don't have to do that. It's sitting right there waiting for us. So that's what we did. We scraped it all up. We dug down till we found alluvium that looked like the historic floodplain. This is up to a 3 or 4 foot cut in places. And we trucked it 100 feet and we spread it out across the barnyard. So this is relatively clean fill. There wasn't much trash in this. And we were left with this nice 3/4 of an acre floodplain. The floodplain was just bare dirt. We had to do something with it. We had to make it function. We had to make it so it wouldn't just wash away. So you can see the brook on the left, floodplain on the brook on the right, floodplain on the left. We brought in like 200 cubic yards of woody material, and we incorporated that into the substrate, into the ground. Half of it is like buried, half of it's sticking out of the ground. You'll see the contractor had fun driving some of these logs vertically. We like to think of that as eagle habitat, but also what it does is it helps provide an anchor. So some of that wood starts to float and drift away. It might get pinned up on those vertical pieces, which are acting as fasteners, try to retain that wood that's either recruited naturally or just mobilized across the floodplain. We also have a vast snowmobile trail going right across this section. So there's one piece where we had to keep it pretty flat, which was hard to see, but we mulched it, we seeded it, And we got a lot of floodplain connection already. We've had a bunch of rain events since August when this was completed, and the floodplain's functioning. It's getting wet. It's not washing away. We're seeing vegetation pop up. And what we did a wetland, native wetland seed mix, but what we also are doing is we're trying this new approach. We call it hydro seeding and direct seeding. And so we're taking tree species, shrub species, and we're actually seeding with raw material that we've collected in the region. So the Northwood Stewardship Center works with Fish and Wildlife Department to have this riparian lands program. They collect millions and millions of seed each summer. And we put 91 million seeds down on this 3/4 acre property or parcel. And you'll ask, why so much seed? Well, most of it was an experiment, and half the seed we thought was junk. So we just went really heavy on the application because it was taking up valuable freezer space, and we just had to put it on the ground. So, it had a lot of local species that we like to see, both for, long-term habitat, but also fast-growing successional species. So you can see they applied it with a hydro seeding unit, which is essentially a slurry of water and seed mix, and also by hand where we couldn't drag the hose because it'd get wound up with woody debris. So after we got those floodplain areas cut and established, stabilized and roughened with floodplain treatments, we were concurrently working on installing 35 beaver dams on all of these tributaries. We didn't put anything on the main stem yet because we're going to use more of a, strategic wood addition, engineered log jam approach on the main stem because of the size of the brook. But all those feeder tributaries coming in, they had been beaten by the cows. They had been ditched and channelized. They'd been, running dry in places, and we wanted to really, retain that sediment, grow back that lush vegetation, and maintain flows for these systems so that they could be fish habitat, rearing streams. And so we put in 35 dams across all these little tributaries. You can see some of them are relatively small, 5 feet across. Some of them are more like 15 or 20 feet across. But we're getting, immediate impoundment. You visualize that water table rising. You see sediment and organic matter and silt depositing on the upstream side. This over here on the right, this is actually a ditch. We called it the T ditch. There was a ditch going along the bottom of the hill slope, and then a perpendicular leg that went down and connected to the brook. We used some of the fill from the floodplain to fill that ditch, and then so essentially removing that hydraulic or hydrologic drain. What happens when you make a ditch? It lowers the water table, it drains that. We want to restore that wetland hydrology. We want to keep water in the ground. We don't want it running off so quickly. So we filled ditches and we roughened them as well. We filled over 1,500 feet of agricultural ditches using fill that we took out of the floodplain. We also patched some of those systems that were coming off the road that had blown out during the floods. You can see this is the early stage of building a BDA. We drive a bunch of posts, we weave structures or weave willows and limbs and logs and whatever piece of wood we can get. And then as we weave them through, we'll actually drive more posts, put some wood on top to kind of act as ballast. And what you really see are, structures that are pretty beefy for a hand-built beaver dam. We did a lot of sod. We used a lot of sod in this project because it was available. You can look around, that's pretty lush ground right there. So you dig a hole, you got this nice meaty root wad full of silt, and we would pack it on the upstream and downstream side of the structure to try to seal that perimeter, try to plug it up nice and tight, because eventually it is going to scour out. Water's going to find a way through. You'd like to get that first, season or two where you're really getting that impoundment, you're really allowing the water storage and the water table to rise. You're getting that accretion of sediment on the upstream side. And so that is really crucial for our objectives in terms of managing sediment passage through this system. So I mentioned an alluvial fan earlier, and this is a great opportunity that we had. So this is the farm road. It went across the brook. You can see the brook. This is the flanking that it would do around that culvert when it get plugged up. And this is the channelized stream that had been dug by landowners of past going along that road. And all the time, this road would hijack the flow from that stream. It would wash out the road and it would dump truckloads of sediment into this brook. And we wanted to get that ditch out of there. And it had previously gone across the road and into this alluvial fan feature. We're like, well, let's put it back. So as we decommissioned this road, we filled this whole ditch in. We roughened the surface. We did exactly what we did on the floodplain. Lots of micro topography. So imagine mounds and ridges, or pits and mounds, ridges and furrows, whatever you want to call it. But I like to say it looks like the Western Front, like just like bombs went off. Wood sticking out of the ground, potholes, hummocks, whatever you want to call it. And what we did is we realigned the stream back to where it was. It now crosses the road. We rebuilt stream banks on this section of the road. And then we allowed it to fan out into this nice gradient. So we have an actual channel that flows this way, and we've got like 10 dams going up this channel. But then we also place dams right where the fan opens up to try to just encourage that water to disperse across the landscape, get out of that channel at every flow recurrence interval. As soon as you get a 1/10 of an inch of rain, we want this water spreading out from the channel. We want to maintain a passable channel for fish if they're going to use this tributary during low water to get up into the forest, but we also want this thing to spread out as much as possible. You can see there's tiny little bits of wood out here. These are all essentially PDAs that we built on the floodplain. It's kind of like a pinball machine. You got all these little deflectors and all these little, staggered obstructions. That helps to push water around, slow it down, trap sediment, retain silt, recharge groundwater. Not that this site had any problem with groundwater recharge, but you also see that we yanked out this culvert, and now the stream is free flowing. We pulled 9 culverts off this property. Here's another shot. You can see all these beaver dams. This is the primary channel, but starting here at this nick point, we put in dams to try to encourage flow to go across this floodplain, make its way back to the channel on its own accord. We're not trying to dictate form or function here. We just want to give it the room that it needs to slow down and spread out. You can see a good shot of this road decommission. This was that heinous gravel road that had washed out all the time. We brought in 2,000 yards of dirt from that floodplain area, brought that road back up to grade, matched the sides, matched the hill slopes on either side, and then let the bombs go off with all the wood and roughening that we did. So this is a great shot. I was able to take this right after we had a rain on snow event. Can't see all that well, but there's water coming down this whole fan in early December or mid-December after this rain, and it's actually still going through its primary channel, but it's also spreading out across this whole fan, except for this one little high and dry knob that we had to avoid because it was too high. We couldn't get water down it. But in the wintertime, there's water everywhere. This is just a couple days ago. This you can see all the posts sticking up out of the snow. The main stem of the brook is way down here, but there's water on this landscape all the time now, whereas previously it had just shunted down that ditch right into the brook. Here's a close-up of that ditch and the road that was always getting hijacked, always hijacking the stream and washing out. You can see even in this picture, that's like 8 inches of silt that cut down in this one rain event. And so this thing was a major contributor of sediment to this really significant fishery. And downstream of this whole project, where it meets Lake Seymour, there's a lot of uproar because the boat access ramp is filling in with silt. And so we're actively trying to reduce the load of silt coming down this brook. Another shot of that road. So, I guess the one thing that I'm really, pleased with this project is, roads are big problems for rivers. I guess you say rivers are big problems for roads. Roads usually give in faster than the river. So in this sense, the road was acting as a major sediment source. It had the purpose of the road had essentially driven, previous landowners to degrade the stream by channelizing it, straightening it, getting it off, getting the water out of there. And we went for a full road obliteration, but there's a lot of other folks out there who would, maybe just armor the stream channel, keep the road in place. We were able to remove the road here, but in other places, you can't. You're gonna have to manage the river for the purpose. But I think there are a lot of opportunities to address road alignments and actually move roads. They do this a lot out west. They physically move the road and they give preferential treatment to the stream because they're sick and tired of patching the road all the time. So I think we need to adopt a little bit of that perspective some places. And in terms of the shallower gradient stream systems that we can work in, they're a lot lower risk. You know, where you have a meadow with an expanse and you can raise the bottom of the channel up by accumulating, you know, sediments, and you can get the water out onto the floodplain, you're actively slowing down the flow in a tributary that feeds into a larger system. If you're slowing down the inputs to that larger system, you're slowing down you're slowing down the big river. You're reducing that peak on the hydrograph. You're stringing it out longer. So you're inherently mitigating downstream impacts by storing water in these upstream headwaters. And that's what we're really trying to do, tackle these upstream headwaters, because downstream will respond as a result of the changes upstream. And roads are conduits. They're a big part of it. So this, to me, looks much like a process-based restoration project. There's wood sticking out everywhere. It's a mess. But guess what? This whole road looks like a wetland now because it's just these hummocks that are holding water all the time. This picture is in September, and it hadn't rained in 2 weeks, and there's just water coming out of the ground. It used to just go down the road, or shunt into that brook or that ditch and into the brook. But now we're retaining it on the ground. Now we have a wetland where there was a really awful, you know, culvert flanking. And so this is a shot of that culvert. You know, it looks beautiful and green in this picture, but it didn't after, you know, a big flood. But now we have this riffle that allows free passage of fish that isn't going to erode every storm. We've got floodplain that isn't obstructed by the prism of the road crossing, of the stream crossing, which was essentially a barrier and was resulting in a lot of, you know, erosive forces because it just impounded so much water. Here's some shots of taking that culvert out. One of the coolest things we found was once we yanked it out, we used some wood to act as grade controls. We brought in native stone that we salvaged out of the barnyard to build this riffle. Can't even see the logs, but they're buried under there, and they key into the bank like 6 feet on each side. But one of the cooler things that we saw is right away we got some sprouting willows, but that the culvert was a ski lift tower. I pulled it out of the ground. I was like, I know what that is. It's got that helical weld. It's got that flange where you butt the two together. Apparently, there was a ski hill 10 miles away from here, and these pieces of pipe tower are all over the valley that people have cut up and used as road crossing. So I'm really hoping to do another project soon and yank out another ski tower. And I'm going to start collecting these things and going to build my own ski hill, and you're all invited. So this is a before and after. This is Jud was a hero because he came out the day we were starting this project on an emergency call that I made to him. I said, Jud, we had a major flood. I need you to bring your drone. And you can see the red line delineates where the floodwaters were. And guess what? This whole barnyard area that we reclaimed, there was no floodplain connection happening here. This is another portion that we reclaimed. This is a third portion that we reclaimed. This turned out to be like a 200-year event. Or sorry, 550 CFS event on the day that we were starting this project. And so it just like really drove home like how important it is to provide room for floodwaters, to provide passage for fish. You can see over here in this corner, this road had just gotten cleaned up, but this is another alluvial fan. It dropped so much sediment that it plugged the culvert, jumped over the road, and blew out half our project site. We had to rebuild the road with the equipment that was coming, just so that we could start the project. And so it's just, you know, so poignant in terms of the timing. And now we are left with a much broader floodplain, a reconnected stream with a bunch of wood that we really hope beavers will take on and manage for us, because it's a lot of work and they're better at it. So we got some stats, but I know it's getting late. People are probably hungry. So I think we should probably move to the Q&A. And yeah, thank you for your time and interest.